Your father was a hugely important figure in Paul Simon's life and career. He has an internship named after him, the Gene Callahan, which
we have a couple of the interns tonight.
Have launched a lot of really good careers in state government. And your brother was a legendary baseball coach here whose number was retired just this spring.
Can I acknowledge my sister-in-law, Stacy Callahan, back there, and my niece, Carly Callahan? That's my brother's widow and his youngest daughter. Yes.
This has been a humbling experience because usually when I have a guest, it's like, okay, I have to introduce them around, but she's introducing me. She knows everyone here, so it's great that
and speaking of Paul Simon, you know Sheila Simon is here as well.
Sheila and Perry, thank you so much. And Martin Simon sent a note of...
Love Martin Simon too.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about your family. You grew up in a political family. Your dad worked for Paul Simon, Alan Dixon, and others. Your mom was a teacher. Talk about just the kind of the political world you grew up in Springfield.
Yeah, so by the way, Sheila Simon knows this, but Paul Simon actually lived in our house. And here's the funny story about this. Do you all know Paul Simon? Did you all know him? I know Sheila knew him fairly well. But, you know, he was kind of this prim and proper guy, right? I mean, and Paul Simon was a fellow at Harvard University. And this is when Sheila and Martin were young. And so after Paul had run for governor and didn't win, unfortunately, like what's wrong with voters, right? Not to elect Paul Simon as governor of the state of Illinois. But he decides to take this fellowship out at Harvard and moves Sheila and Martin and their mother, Jean, and they go out there. After that was over, he decides he's going to come back to Illinois, but Sheila and Martin were in school, and he needed a place to live in Springfield, which is where my brother and my sister and my mom and dad and I lived. So Paul lived in our house for a few months before he ends up starting the public affairs reporting program at what was then Sangamon State University. So did anybody here know my dad, Gene Callahan? Okay, gosh, wow, that's a lot. So Gene and Scott Shear worked with my dad and with Alan Dixon for many years. But my dad was the ultimate slob. I mean, like totally, like, you know, so you think about like the ultimate slob and then Paul Simon, prim and proper. And I still remember Paul would wear a robe and like it was almost like he would have worn his bow tie to bed or something because he was so prim and proper. And my dad always had stains that usually stopped at his belly. And he'd wear this pink tie-dyed shirt that our neighbor had made for him. And so it was literally like having Felix and Oscar in our house in real time. But so I guess growing up in a household like this, one of Paul Simon's early hires was this guy, you might know his name, Dick Durbin. So Dick actually reported to my dad. And Paul and Dick were driving down to Southern Illinois. And Dick says to Paul, I cannot work with this guy, Gene Callahan. And then Paul finally said, you're just going to have to get used to him. He's an acquired taste. But so that said, we'd have people like Paul Simon and Dick Durbin and just some wonderful people over at our house growing up. And what was so great about our household is never, not once in my entire childhood, did my dad ever say, go away, little girl, this is an adult conversation. So I could sit there and listen to just these amazing stories and these amazing conversations until it was time to go to bed. And I did have a price of admission, which was, Cher, can you go to the fridge and grab me a bud? And so that is what I had to do to stay there. And I would like, you know how you'd have the freezer on top and the refrigerator door on the bottom. I would kind of duck down, take a quick swig of the bud, and then go back and deliver it. But I mean, I just cannot think of a better childhood. If you liked politics, our household was 58 Meadowlark Lane, Springfield, Illinois was a great place to be. And, you know, my mom, she was a preschool teacher. So she was not like she didn't teach it at elementary or junior high or high school or anything. She was a preschool teacher and a social worker. But my mom, her nickname that our neighbor, her crews named her Saint Anne, because literally she would cook and make food no matter who stopped by, would make drinks for whoever stopped by. But yeah, that was our growing up years. My grandfather was in the state legislature, so it was such a treat for us as really little kids when my grandma and grandpa got to stay with us when they were in session. So it was politics, sports, family / beer. That was the Callahan household.
Well, let's talk about journalism, because one of your first career decisions was to enter the public affairs reporting program in Springfield. Terrific program, and then that launched a career. Talk about your life as a reporter for 17 years, I think it was.
Yeah, I loved it, and I thought I would do that the rest of my life. Anybody here know Mike Lawrence? Okay, so yeah, Mike Lawrence was my first boss in journalism. And he was probably the toughest boss I ever had, but I learned so much from him. And I remember one time, he was really tough. And do you ever see him yell at anybody? Yeah, okay, like that. Well, I remember one time I'm this intern and we're in the state capitol where all the state capitol building where all of the news bureaus used to be. And I don't remember even what I did, but I screwed up somehow. And he was yelling at me in the middle of the area where reporters would come and go and all of that. And finally I thought, and I was, what was I, 21 years old? And I'm like, Mike, can you yell at me in the office? Because I really don't want to be yelled at in front of all of these people. And, the lesson there, though, is, I feel I could always stand up for myself, which I think in politics is really important. In journalism, that's really important. And it was something that, that really my parents instilled in us, that we're no better than anybody, but we're also no worse than anybody. And I think that's a really good lesson to carry through life. And so I started out with Mike Lawrence as the bureau chief. I had 2 job offers when I was done with my internship. So I could have ended up down here because one of the job offers was at the Southern Illinoisan. So I had that job offer and I had the Quad City Times. And I ended up taking the Quad City Times job, which is really kind of set the foundation for my personal life and really my professional life from then on. I started out on the police beat. And my days off were Wednesday and Thursday. Never had a weekend off. My hours were 5 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. I'm in a town that I didn't know anybody, and worked every weekend. So you think, okay, this is really going to be good for somebody in her early 20s who didn't know anybody, who never had a weekend off. And you know what? I ended up meeting the guy who was my husband. And here's how we met. I was covering the police beat. He was a rookie cop. I was this rookie police reporter. I get invited to this party at a bar called the Lil Cowbell. Not Little, Lil. They have seat belts on the bar stools, just in case you drink a little too much so you don't fall off. And he was there at this third shift party, which means it started at 8 in the morning. And I showed up at 10, which means he had been there for 2 hours. And he ends up asking me out, and we end up going out, later get married, have 3 kids. And so, I think about, like, when you think about life decisions, and had I ended up down here, one of us might have been married. You never know. But so started out on the police beat, but then covered City Hall. I was an investigative reporter. I led a team of reporters where every day our job was to have the page 1 centerpiece story. I, at one point, led half of the newsroom as an editor. But my last beat, and again, this kind of leads to what happens in life. If you say yes to interesting things, I was a health editor, and I wrote this profile about this new CEO of this health system. And as he had settled into his job, he made a decision that he wanted to rebuild his communications department. And he thought of me. He liked the story I wrote. He liked how I interviewed him. And I get this call saying, hey, we want you to run our communications division. So that led, it's a kind of a long story. I didn't want to leave journalism because I loved it, but I decided I was going to. That led to me running communications for a smaller group of hospitals. He ends up getting promoted to CEO of a multi-billion-dollar, multi-state health system. He brings me along. I'm vice president of all of that, which allowed me then to get involved in politics. Because as a journalist, as you probably know, you can't do anything in politics. You can't pound a yard sign. You can't contribute. You can't go door to door. The only thing you can do as a journalist is vote, because you got to cover the people who are elected officials. And so when I went into healthcare, I ended up running for city council, and then which led to me then a little bit later, as you said before, running for Congress.
Well, let's talk about your first campaign for city council. I mean, do you remember going door to door and just kind of gathering your breath and introducing yourself? I mean, what was that first campaign like?
Yeah, so it was East Moline, Illinois, population 21,000, and I was running for the 4th ward, which meant my entire political base was representing 3,000 people if I were to win that. And so I made a decision, because it was 3,000 people, which is about 1,000 doors. Now, that doesn't mean 1,000 Democrats. I was running in the Democratic primary. It doesn't mean 1,000 or 3,000 people who are registered to vote. It means that there were about 1,000 homes. And I thought, well, that's doable. I'm just going to knock on every door. Because my view was this. My view was, if I win, I'm not going to just represent the Democrats. I'm not going to just represent the people who are registered voters. I'm going to represent all 3,000 of these people. So I knocked on every door twice. And it was really an amazing experience. And you know this, John. Do we have any journalists in the room? Okay, so you know what you have to do as a journalist. You have to make people comfortable, as soon as you meet them, if you're going to get them to talk with you. And you also have to be comfortable talking to people from all different backgrounds. Rich, poor, black, white, you have to be comfortable talking to anyone. And so it was not difficult for me, and in fact, I loved it. But if you know the cycle of a municipal election, it's always in the winter, and it's in the Quad Cities, it's really cold. It's not like this beautiful weather down in Carbondale or Carterville or Marion. It's freezing. And it was so cold that I couldn't even, the yard signs wouldn't go in the ground. So my husband had to buy this giant drill bit and drill into the frozen tundra to be able to put our yard signs in. But yeah, so that was our campaign. It was a 3-way primary. I ended up winning overwhelmingly. I still remember, I'm terrible at numbers, but I still remember the numbers, because it was 44% to 33% to 22%. And I won, and then there was no Republican who was running. And so when I won the primary, I ended up being then elected.
Well, we had a great conversation with students today, and you're talking about your first race for Congress. And you said you entered a crowded primary in which you were a decided underdog. And your stance was, the only thing I can do is just outwork my opponent. So talk about that first race and just how you approached it.
So it was 2011, and by this time I had been with this health system for 10 years. And I do a really deep dive on my life every 10 years to figure out, am I doing everything I want to do professionally? Am I doing everything I want to do personally? Do I want to make any change? So can I talk about why I ran, first of all? Because I think anybody here in elected office I know Glenn Pichard knows this kind of stuff inside and out. Anybody else ever run or want to run? Okay, yeah, a few of you running for state's attorney over here. Knowing your why is really, really important, right? Because people are going to ask you, why are you running for Congress? Why are you running for President of the United States? And so understanding what that why is really, really important. So it's 2011, so I'll tell you a little bit about how this led to me running. I was in city council. Again, my whole political base was 3,000 people, so just huge. And keep in mind, when you're in Congress, Glenn Pichard, I mean, how many did you represent? It was 711,000 people in my congressional district. It was probably 675. So your political base going from 3,000 to 711,000 is a big jump. But so why did I want to run for this? There was a Republican who was already in office. So beating an incumbent is hard. It's a swing district, so that makes it kind of hard as well. But here's what was happening. Here was my why. I was working in healthcare, and the guy who was was running for the seat, the Republican, in 2010. So this would have been 2 years earlier. He was a Tea Partier. His only thing that he wanted to accomplish was to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. That was his big platform, wanted to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. I'm working in healthcare, so I understand healthcare. I understand that we are on an unsustainable path as a country. Costs kept going up and up and up. There was nothing in America where the cost was going up more, other than they were kind of parallel, but higher ed was the other thing. At the same time, though, while the costs were going up, the outcomes for patients were not. So how do we as a nation get to a better place where costs don't keep going up and where patient results can improve? So that was happening on a national stage. I understood healthcare. On a personal level, within a week of that guy being elected to represent me and my family and the other 711,000 people in our region, what happened within a week of that election was, here's the SIU connection. My brother, Stacy's husband, Carly's dad, he died within a week of that election. And so on a very personal level, their medical bills were horrible, absolutely horrible. We were lucky enough where my mom and my dad and my sister and I could help a little. We had to have fundraisers, but literally their finances just would have been, beyond what they would have been able to take care of. And you look at most families, and most families weren't lucky enough like we were, where we could help. And so you think about families, the number one cause of bankruptcy were medical bills. So that was my personal motivation. Understood healthcare, knew what my brother and his family had to go through, and really didn't appreciate this guy representing all of us. So I decided to run against him. So to John's point, there ended up being 6 people in the primary. Right? So I think we all had the same idea. It was like, let's beat this guy. So we all had the same idea, but 6 people. And on paper, I should not have won. We had a sitting state senator who is a really good guy. He was not my friend at the time, and he did not like me for a little while, but really, really good guy. He was getting a lot of the endorsements, especially from organized labor, because he had great relationships with those in organized labor. So he was running. Another former longtime state rep who had pretty good name ID was also running. He should have been able to do better than I did. Then we had a mayor of a city that was about the same size as East Moline, but he was a mayor of that whole city. So again, on paper, all 3 of those guys should have been better than I was. And then we had 2 others and I. And so what happened is, after the first quarter, and this gets down to working hard, I outraised all 5 of my opponents combined. So it did help to have a lot of friends who were willing to give. And I have a close friend of mine who used to say, it's really expensive to know the Callahans. You guys are always raising money for something, whether it was SIU baseball or my political campaigns or whatever it was. So what happens is that is a sign of strength, and how you have to get your mind around raising money, because it's distasteful. I understand that, but how I could get my mind around it is that is how I'm going to be able to communicate with voters. Because if I didn't raise the money in a very expensive race, it ended up being a $14 million race, my very first campaign. Now, I didn't have to raise all of that. It was $7 million on one side, $7 million on the other, and you had outside people coming in to help. But it was a $14 million race. And so what ends up happening is they start dropping out. And so by the time the primary was held, it was 3 candidates, and the other 2 were very weak. And I beat them pretty easily, then went on to beat the incumbent, who I set out to beat to begin with, beat him by 6 points. 2 years later, he runs against me again. I beat him by 11 points. And then I can tell you, though, we would start seeing the district. If you want to talk about the district and kind of the changing political climate, we can get into that. But things really started getting tougher and tougher and tougher and tougher in the political, like downstate districts are getting for Democrats.
Well, let's talk just about maybe you enter the House, and what was your sort of theory about how to be an influential, important lawmaker? I mean, what was the
tell me how you do that. Sorry, how do you do that?
What was the balance between just, obviously making sure your constituents were up to speed on what you're doing, and then just choosing issues and finding ways to have an impact? I mean, how did you even approach that?
Well, I remember my first term, and my emotion every single night. You have to stay in DC when you go to DC, and so I had a little less than 500 square foot apartment, and which was a couple blocks from my office. And I remember going to my apartment every night after the very, very full days. And if I were to size up my emotion every night, and really at the end of that first term, it would be frustration. Nothing moved as fast as I wanted it to move. The coalitions that I thought would be easier to build were very, very difficult. I started out thinking, I am going to be bipartisan. I reached out to we had a very large class in 2012, 50 freshman Democrats, 30 freshman Republicans, so 80 brand new members altogether. That's a lot. I reached out to every one of the Republicans and I said, I'm a Democrat from a swing district. I would really like to work together if we can find ways to work together. So I just want to reach my hand out to you and let you know if you want to work together, I'm here. It was really difficult. A lot of people really didn't want to, for political reasons, probably more than anything else, didn't really want to work together. So that was hard. Setting up 3 offices in Illinois, 1 in DC, that's hard. You build everything from scratch. Everything is built from scratch. You hire your chief of staff, your legislative director, your legislative aide, your scheduler, your staff assistant, your district director. But think about that, building all of that in a very short amount of time from scratch. So I would say that was my overall emotion. I'm very impatient. I'm also very, very competitive. I played basketball and volleyball in college, not at University of Maryland, I wasn't that good, but at Illinois College, Division III. And so I want to win, I want to move, I want all of that stuff. And it was just, all of that was really, really hard. And but how I decided to approach the job was much like I approached being a journalist, which is very hands-on, being with people instead of just calling people. We started 3 things in my first couple terms, all of which would go on to be really, really helpful to me. One was we did something called Supermarket Saturdays. So every Saturday, I would go out with my, who was a person in my district who ran my local offices, and I worked with her the entire time I was in office. She and I would go out. We would walk the aisles of grocery stores all over our 7,000 square mile congressional district, 14 counties. Goes all the way up to the Wisconsin state line, over to the Mississippi River into central Illinois. And I would go up to people if they weren't really speeding, going really, really fast with their carts, or if they would make eye contact, I would just say, I'm Cheri Bustos. I represent this area in Congress. I'll be flying back out to Washington, D.C. on Monday. Is there anything on your mind that you'd like me to know about? Or is there anything you want me to fight for or fight against? But open-ended questions, not questions that they could answer with a yes or no, but open-ended questions. And John, I really think that I could go every election cycle without polling based on what I would hear. And there were always common themes. I mean, it was the economy, really for my first couple of terms. It was like, jobs. It was people who were going to college. I remember one guy who do you guys have Hy-Vee grocery stores down here? No. You know what Hy-Vee is? It's a grocery store chain that we have a lot in our area. But I remember this guy, he was working in the deli at the Hy-Vee grocery store. And he said he had, I don't remember the exact amount, but a lot of debt because he went to culinary school and he had this dream that he was going to be one of these fancy chefs. And he was working in the Hy-Vee deli and had all this debt, not making that great of money. So it was stories like that. Again, as a journalist, it's like you crave hearing those stories. So we did that every Saturday. The other thing we did is we called it Cheri on shift, which meant that I job shadowed people. I did shift work with people all over our congressional district. By the time I left office, we did 120 of these. And it was everything from processing carp out of the Illinois River. It was changing street bulbs 30 feet up in a cherry picker with a Illinois Brotherhood of Electrical Workers employee, to making, pouring hot steel into molds, to pounding steel at the foundry, we did 120 different jobs. And when I was with any of these workers, I would have the chance to say, what do you do for fun? And that is a very polite way of figuring out, do they have disposable income? And it's really amazing what you would hear to those questions, and people who work really, really, really hard to support their families, and just how hard life can be, and the pride that they would take in their jobs also. So I would always ask that. And if they were out of earshot of their bosses, I might ask them, were you able to take a vacation in the past year? It's also amazing what you hear about that. But you'd have these intimate conversations with people, and you'd learn a lot about the people who you represent. And when you're a member of Congress, it looks like a driver's license. It's about the size of a driver's license. I should have brought that with me. And that's how you vote. You put it in the little voting booth that's at the end of every other row on the House floor. And you picture those stories and you think about, am I doing right by the people that I'm representing? And then the third thing we did, when town halls started getting really nasty, it's like, believe me, it's not pleasant to be in front of people who are just constantly yelling at you and grandstanding, getting at the mic and, yelling, cussing, whatever it is. So we made a decision that we were going to do town halls in libraries. So what were you taught as a young child in the library? Be nice. So you didn't have any of that grandstanding. There was not even a mic. But there was a program called the Surplus Book Program. The Library of Congress would give you, a member of Congress, you could take as many books as you wanted and give them to any nonprofit you wanted. And because libraries were nonprofits, we would take 50 books. I would carry 25. My district director would carry the other 25. And then we would have our town halls in libraries where people were polite. And so Gail Pyatt is here, right here. Her son, John Pyatt, out of Pinckneyville, was my chief of staff. So if you know John, he could tell you all of these stories and all the kind of the back side of all of these stories, which there's a lot of drama associated with all of this. But I want to recognize Gail and her son, John, who is just, not only was he my longtime chief of staff, but really one of my dearest friends also. So we had Southern Illinois well represented. Yusuf Nexad, who is right back there from Carterville. He was on my legislative team. How we would build our staff, going back to building a staff, all of our interviews, you have people from all over the country who interview. But if you were from Illinois, you got an extra point. And if you were from our congressional district, you got an extra 2 points. So since John and Yusuf were from Illinois, but not from our congressional district, they were extra special to be able to be on our staff. But that was really important for us. We wanted people to understand the state of Illinois and, the so-called flyover country. That was always really, really important to me, as it was. Scott Scheer can talk to you about Alan Dixon. My dad was Alan Dixon's chief of staff. Scott Scheer worked for Alan Dixon, with Alan Dixon for a number of years, but his tagline was from Illinois for Illinois. And virtually their entire staff was from Illinois. And I think that's really, really important to understand that, we are not New York City. We are not San Francisco. We are not LA. We are Illinois. And it was very important that we understood, everybody on our staff understood that.
Well, let's talk, when you were in the House, you rose through the ranks. You came to chair the House Congressional Campaign Committee, which basically is overseeing the main races for the House Democrats. Talk about that, and also maybe connect it to, I remember the first time we met, we were talking about just campaigning, and you had said and I guess this gets to how politics has changed, that when you would go back in the district on the weekend, the other party would have someone shadowing you with a TV camera, just trying to catch you at moments where you're doing, your jumper flares or something like that. Just talk about modern campaigning, and then also the broader assignment of leading the House Democratic campaign effort.
Yeah, have you guys ever heard the term tracker? Okay, so what a tracker is, and this happens in all of these big campaigns. The other side will put a camera in your face everywhere you go. And they try to irritate you everywhere you go. So they will say either something outrageous, why did you do this? Or why did you vote this way? And why do you hate whatever it is? But they will try to get under your skin. And the reason they do this is because it's been effective in the past. If you want to look at the 17th Congressional District, which is what I represented, and if you want to see why that Tea Party guy defeated the Democrat before him, it was because of trackers. Do you know the story?
I've heard of it.
Okay, so the member of Congress's name was Phil Hare. And this was when Occupy Wall Street was, that was all going crazy, and the Tea Party was all going crazy, and Congress had passed the Affordable Care Act, and this tracker gets in Phil Hare's face. Phil had been in Congress, and says, well, isn't it a violation that you voted of the Constitution that you voted for the Affordable Care Act? And Phil gets really mad and yells out, who cares about the Constitution? And then goes on to explain that. Well, all that took was that little video, and it was video. And the Republicans put millions of dollars behind that and turned this into a television ad. And Phil Hare lost by double digits as a result of that. So that is why they have trackers in your face everywhere you go. And so you learn very early on, you just don't react to them. You don't respond, you don't do anything. And so I guess the link to running the political arm of House Democrats is, that's part of what you teach candidates. And, a lot of these people are first-time candidates. Some have never run for anything in their lives, and all of a sudden they're running for Congress. And so, believe me, you go from, even though I had been a newspaper reporter and I had a column, and my picture was in our paper once a week, but you realize it's really kind of small potatoes, as opposed to when all of a sudden your television ads start running. And you go from someone who's fairly unknown to think about $14 million worth of ads, and how all of a sudden you're in your face, because the opposition is running your face on everything too, because they want to make you look bad. And so you've got to, when you're overseeing all of these ads, you've got to kind of gear people up for this. And when you're recruiting people to run, you've got to figure out, are they going to be able to raise the money? Are they going to be thick-skinned enough to be able to put up with these trackers in their face all the time? Are they and their families, because it becomes a family affair, are they going to be able to withstand millions of dollars of attack ads? Do they have the strength to do that? And so you size up all of that when you are figuring out who's the best candidate to run and to win in some of the toughest districts all over the country. So that's part of what you do when you're running the political arm of House Democrats. And on top of that, we ended up raising, this is obviously a team effort, but $333 million, $333 million that election cycle for House candidates all over the country that were targets of ours.
And the backdrop is you're in a district that is solidly pro-Trump. I mean, emphatically so by the end of your career. I mean, talk about, trying to keep track of all these congressional races across the country, and also working in a district in which you know that people are nipping at your heels.
Yeah, so in hindsight, really is not a great move to run the political arm of House Democrats when your brand at home was being this really bipartisan person. Because think about it. So the political arm is constantly, all day long, putting out news releases that are saying bad things about Republicans. Now, my name wasn't attached to all of those, but I was running the political arm of House Democrats that's putting all of this out. So it seemed against brand at home. So that's number one. Number two, our congressional district flipped 17 points from Obama in 2012 to Trump from 2012 to Trump in 2016. In 4 years, it flipped 17 points. It was one of the biggest swings of any congressional district in the entire nation. And then, a couple years later, I'm running again the political arm of House Democrats in this Trump district. And so I continued to do very well. In fact, I won by one of the largest margins of any Democrat in the country in a Trump district. I won by 20 points. And then 2 years later, I won by 24 points. So I was still doing pretty well. But then my last race, and there's a lot of reasons why I decided not to run again. I've never lost an election, so I love that I left on my own terms, won 7 straight elections, 2 for city council, 5 for Congress, left on my own terms. But it was that last race, Gail Pyatt knows this because she had to probably counsel her son nonstop about it was the toughest 2 years politically and emotionally and professionally of my life. And it was really, really hard. Getting beat up at home. I would have Democrats actually outside of my office protesting because they were farther left than I was because they didn't understand why there was some legislation that they wanted me to be on that I wasn't on. And it's kind of like, the first rule of politics is first you got to win. And I'm not saying you win unfairly. I'm not saying you win in any kind of unethical way. I'm not saying you win by compromising your values, but first you got to win. And that is, in how you win in a tough district as a Democrat is you better understand the people that you're representing. And so I would have these protesters who they probably could have won easily in Nancy Pelosi's district. That is like a Democrat plus 70 or whatever, but not in a Trump district. And so if you don't win, you can't serve. If you can't serve, you can't represent the people that you're there to represent. So I'm a practical politician, and that I can tell you that was very aggravating to me. I would say go across the Mississippi River and go protest outside the Republicans' office. Don't protest a Democrat. But it was a very tough couple years, again, politically, emotionally, professionally, all of that.
So what's the best part of being in Congress and what's the worst?
Best, that you get to meet different people every single day. You get to hear amazing stories. You're in a position every single day to help people. It was the same way I viewed it as being a journalist. Every day you walked into the newsroom, you could help people. And that's how I viewed Congress. Every single day you could help people in a lot of different ways. I was the top Democrat to bring back community project funding in the entire U.S. House of Representatives. There was one Republican who got slightly more than I did. Believe me, I wanted to be number 1 overall, but I was the top Democrat. So bringing home resources for the district to improve the district that where I lived and my family lived, and and every day is different. I like variety. Again, if you're competitive, if you like to be where the action is, if you like to be able to help people, it's like nothing's better. The worst part was, I was on the House floor on January 6th. And for my family, that was their last straw. I text them in the middle of sitting on the House floor where there is an angry mob trying to break in. And I text them and I said, I'm okay. And everyone in my family, my immediate family, my 3 sons, my 3 daughters-in-law, and my husband, they all said, what do you mean? And I'm like, turn on the TV. And then they're like, oh, crap. So, then it was constant texting back and forth. And, but yeah, I was, if you can picture the center aisle where the president walks through for the State of the Union, that is where the mob was coming up and broke out the windows. I was sitting just a few rows from that and just a couple seats over when all of this was happening. I was sitting next to, there were only 25 Democrats on the floor that day. I don't know if you knew this, but it was COVID. We had to sit a seat apart, and we were all going to be there in waves because because of COVID, we couldn't have everybody there. So there were only 25 Democrats on the House floor, and then there were probably about that many in the gallery. But we all had to sit a seat apart. And so a colleague of mine hands me his phone because nobody really knew what was going on for a little bit. And it showed people surrounding the Capitol. And I said, what is that? And he goes, this is the news. And I said, when was that shot? And he goes, this is live. And then the next thing you know, somebody's whispering in Nancy Pelosi's ear and she's swept off of the House floor. Then Steny Hoyer, who's the number 2 Democrat, somebody's whispering in his ear and he's swept off the floor. Then we all started figuring out what was going on. Somebody from Capitol Police gets in front of us and tells us to be prepared, that the Capitol had been breached, to be prepared to get on the floor. And then the next announcement a few minutes later was, get your gas masks out. I had no idea that under every chair on the House floor was a gas mask. I literally, I guess we were trained about that at new member orientation. But like, who thinks that you're going to need a gas mask, right? So we were all asked to get that out. I couldn't open it because they're like, probably people who have served in the military know this, but they're sealed. Anybody here serve in the military? Okay, so I don't know, when you were in the military, were the gas masks like sealed inside of this plastic stuff? Okay, so then you got to like figure out how you're going to open that up. I couldn't open it. So this guy who was a freshman member of Congress from Indiana, he had been in office for 3 days at that point, because swearing in was January 3rd. He comes up to me and he said, let me help you with that. So he opens mine. I have to hand mine to Barbara Lee, who was sitting to my right. She's now running for Senate in California, because she couldn't open hers either. So I give her mine. I hand her package to him. He opens that, gives that back to me. And then he said, they're going to try to break through that back door. Why don't we try to get more toward the front door where we will probably be evacuated? I mean, he was in office for all of 3 days, and he was perfectly calm, was trying to help. And so then the next thing is we were escorted out by Capitol Police. My husband's texted me. My husband, by the way, has been in, I told you we met when he was a rookie cop. He went on to be sheriff of our county. And his text to me was, listen to police. Just follow whatever they tell you to do. Just listen to them. They will keep you safe. And then you see later what happened to police and what they had to go through. But so we're escorted off, and we're going through the tunnels and all of this kind of stuff. It was within seconds of the last member of Congress being swept off the floor that the woman was killed, where they were trying to come, and which was right off of the House floor. So that just gives you a little context of the timing of what was going on. And so again, for my family, that was their last straw. They said, my husband says, I don't see things getting better. There are other things you can do with your talent. And so we took a family vote. It was at Easter after that, and I announced a couple weeks later that I wasn't going to run for re-election. And here I am today. So, but yeah, that was politics changed a lot. But there's again, 95% of my job I loved. I absolutely loved. But the 5% wasn't very unpleasant.
One more question for me, and then I'm going to open it up to 4.
All right, sounds good.
Tell us about Nancy Pelosi up close. What does she like to work with? Why is she so, even her John Boehner, again, it was unveiling her portrait and said, one of the most effective House speakers in American history. What made her so good?
Well, I will tell you that the public, how she has been portrayed by the other side of the aisle is completely inaccurate. She is one of the most loyal persons I have ever known. She had my back nonstop. She never didn't have my back. So my first meeting when I was running the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, you fly out to DC every time we're in session, because I went home because I had to be home politically. I had to be home representing people. So you'd fly in on a Monday or Tuesday. My first meeting on every fly-in day was for 30 minutes one-on-one with Nancy Pelosi in her speaker's office. So nobody else around. So I worked very closely with her. She is loyal. She knows people's families. She cares about people's families. She is very smart politically. When somebody labeled her, that she was drinking and slurring her words, she doesn't drink. She doesn't take drugs. She loves her family. She has a wonderful husband who was beaten to a pulp by a crazed person wielding a hammer. He's a wonderful husband. They have 5 wonderful kids. Her grandkids are awesome. I think the world of her, and I learned a ton from her. And I think how she's been portrayed is totally inaccurate. I think she'll go down in history as being one of the most effective speakers of the U.S. House of Representatives, male, female, obviously the only female in the history, but she's really, I think the world of her.
Well, just a final follow-up that, I read one article where she said, now I don't have power, but I have influence. What is her role, as you can tell now? I mean, is she sort of the wise person who people are consulting for kind of a big picture view, or why is she
actually involved in her official title is now Speaker Emerita. I always thought it was emeritus, but I'm sure is that emerita a word? But it is. And so my last leadership, I was in House leadership for 6 of my 10 years in office, which meant that I was with, Nancy Pelosi for, in the leadership meetings for 6 of my last years in Congress. And so my last job in leadership was I was co-chair of steering and policy. Why that's an important job is you are involved in making the decisions of everybody's committee assignments. So you can imagine that's a pretty good job to be in. So when she announced that she was not going to run for speaker again, what was she going to do? Just be a rank and file member of Congress? I can tell you that would be really, can you imagine? She's been in leadership for 20 years? Not always at the speaker or the leader level, but in various, one of the top 3 positions in House Democrats for 20-ish years. And so it was her staff who came to us as the 3 co-chairs of steering and policy and saying, let's talk about making her Speaker Emerita. And so we're thinking, and we had I think 2 weeks in session before we were going to be done. It's okay, we got to do this pretty fast. So we got this worked out where it wasn't an official vote, but it was Hakeem Jeffries as the new lead Democrat, where we had him make the motion, and we just said, okay. It was okay. And so it was kind of really low key, and then the announcement was made that she was going to be this chair emerita. But she's the greatest fundraiser in the history of politics. She's got all this institutional knowledge. And I'm not in Congress there now, so I don't know how exactly they're all tapping into her, but she's still revered among Democrats in Washington, D.C.
Well, let's open it up to questions. Cheri, why don't you call on people as...
Okay, so here's my rule when somebody asks questions is it's simple. Got to say your name and where you're from, and that's it.
I can do that. My name is Faith Miller. I'm from Carbondale. And you were speaking a lot about your background, journalism background, and you also talked about not believing reports, especially about Speaker Pelosi. So who do you look to that has journalistic integrity that we can count on, that we can believe, besides John Jackson? To believe what we hear, because there's a lot of noise, and I want to know if you can share who should we be listening to?
Thanks, Faith. I think that's a great question. We should ask John Jackson too what he follows. But here's what I learned being in Washington: you can't walk to any of the House office buildings or the Senate office buildings or the Capitol, or from your house, from your office to the Capitol, without running into multiple reporters. They are everywhere out there. And the reporters who seem to be the ones who rise through the ranks are the ones who write a lot of provocative things and can get people to click, because it's, so much is online now, and to click on their stories. So there's one of the worst points in my life involved, my time in Congress involved a reporter who knew she got it wrong, but wouldn't correct it. And I'll tell you the story. She was writing this story that I told her was inaccurate. I told her I could prove to her it was inaccurate by showing her documentation that was inaccurate. And she said, well, I have somebody on the record using her name saying this. I said, look, I was a journalist for 17 years. It doesn't matter that she's on the record saying it is inaccurate, and it's very hurtful if you write this. And so she was going to write it, and so I had my comms director, I said, call her editor, and this is going to be very hurtful if this is out there. And so my comms director called the editor, and he said, she's got it on the record. And so, where is John Jackson? John, is that journalistically, is that the right thing to do? It is not the right thing to do. And I can tell you, as someone who was a reporter for 17 years, I would not have written that story because I showed her, it proved in black and white that it was inaccurate. So that is the one reporter. And I played every year in the Congressional Women's Softball game. And our opponent, by the way, the men's baseball team, Congressional baseball team, you know how they play their games? It's Republicans against Democrats. The women, our opponent is the Washington Press Corps, the Women's Washington Press Corps. But we as members, we play Democrats and Republicans together, and we all get along, we talk about our families, and we put politics aside. But that's also a gender difference, so there's a lot to be said about that. So, but the one person, my goal in every game was to play well, to try to win, and not to hurt anybody. I broke, do you remember, Donna Edwards used to be a member of Congress from Maryland, then ran for Senate, and she's a commentator now. I broke her nose when I was a freshman member at practice. And so my goal was always not to hurt anybody. But that reporter who wrote that story, I was always kind of like, you know what, if I hit a line drive and it happens to hurt her, I never did that. But that's the one reporter who I just had no use for to this day. That said, what do I trust the New York Times. I read the New York Times every day. I trust the Washington Post. I am one that, the mainstream press is not the enemy. But the people who pretend to be reporters and do the clickbait stuff, I don't have a whole lot of use for them. But I think the New York Times is an outstanding. I listen to the Daily. Anybody listen to podcasts here? I am like totally into great podcasts. Like I love being able to drill deeper down on some stories. But yes, and on the local level, the local press, I get a weekly newspaper delivered to my home still. And they just had the publisher just had an article how their prices are going to have to go up. And right, you know how much it costs for a year's subscription of the weekly paper? $40. And the prices are going to go up, I think they said like to 50 or 60. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I am so glad to pay that. I learned so much about the community through our weekly paper. But yes, those are my sources. Center for Medicare, Medicaid Innovation, CMMI, is that what it is, Yusuf? Yeah. So I thought that had the most promise in the Affordable Care Act because it called for these little pilot programs that health systems could undertake and would be, the funding of them would be supported through the Affordable Care Act. So the whole idea was you might start at a regional level, and if it works, then go statewide, and if that worked, go region-wide, multi-state. If that worked, go nationwide. And I don't think that ever played out to the level that it should have, but I think to this day it has good potential if that played out. One of the last votes I took in Congress was what is being implemented right now, which is Medicare now can finally negotiate the price of prescription drugs. Now, it's not as big as it should be, but the first 10 drugs that's happening, that's in the process of happening now. That's a really important way to bring down the costs of healthcare. And that made a difference. And, but yeah, there's a lot more work that needs to happen. I would say as one of 435 members of the House, I think if I look back on successes, it was really taking really good care of the district that I represented. That was one of my highest priorities, and I think we did really well in that area. But the biggest legislation is really, really hard. I think you get better every. Glenn, how long were you in Congress?
10 years.
10 years, same amount of time. Didn't you get better every year? I mean, yeah, I think so too. I think the most successful time was just, every year we got a little bit better and we got a little bit more passed. And, from a policy perspective and bringing home that community project funding was really, really important. We got $55 million the first year that was brought into where we approved that as members of Congress. $55 million just for our congressional district made a huge difference for our area. Here I'll tell you a piece of legislation that we worked on for years. It was lawyers in the room. Lawyers in the room. Oh, okay. So you guys know what forced arbitration is? Okay, Perry and Sheila know what that is. So we changed. Forced arbitration is that if, let's say you are you're working for, I'll give you a real life example. You are working for a company that owns Kay Jewelers and Jared Jewelers, and you are a woman, and you are forced to, if you're in management, you're forced to go to these conferences where if you're married, your spouse is not allowed to go, where the men there might do something like grope you. You might wake up to, this is really graphic, I don't know if we have, okay, it's too graphic, where you would wake up and maybe something really horrible is happening to you at the hands of the men who are running the company. And this happens to go on for years and years and years and years to 69,000 women. But they could do nothing about it because in their employment contract was something called forced arbitration. So the only thing you could do is you could go to your HR department and they would try to figure out, just to keep things quiet. So this is happening to millions of workers all over the country under these forced arbitration clauses. Forced arbitration clauses are also part of a lot of like rideshare apps. And it basically says, you can't take me to court. You can't take me to court. You can only bring this up and maybe we'll settle it, maybe we won't. So I read this article about this forced arbitration. I'm not a lawyer, so I didn't even know what that was until I read this article in the Washington Post about these 69,000 women. And we write a piece of legislation saying in sexual assault or sexual harassment cases, those should be null and void. Worked on that for 5 years. We got it passed in my last term, and President Biden signed it into law. That changes a lot of people's lives. Then we followed up a few months later and got rid of non-disclosure agreements as well. So for sexual assault and sexual harassment only. But that said, do we want to do it for a lot more? Yes, but that is what we were able to get passed. And we had to get bipartisan support in order to make that happen, pass the House, the Senate, and to have President Biden sign that into law. So maybe we didn't do as much as we would have liked in healthcare, but we did change things like that impact millions of people's lives. It's a journalist. Are you a current journalist?
Oh, no, I'm not. I am a grad student now.
Okay, very good. Name and where you're from?
I am Kazi Hassan. I am from Kabul.
You're from?
Oh,
No, what town do you live in?
I'm living here for 3 years.
Okay, very good. Where from?
Bangladesh.
Okay, Bangladesh, okay. Thank you, good to meet you.
My question is that media are playing a very crucial role in election.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think the media help you or media somehow impede you in your elections?
For the most part,
How did you get benefit?
For the most part, the media was very fair to me. On a local level, I think the media was extremely fair to me. I had one reporter who called me pro-abortion, and I called him and I said, Ed, I know the guy, I used to be his boss, so I called him, I was his editor, I should say, but I called him and I said, Ed, I am not pro-abortion. You can call me pro-choice, but don't call me pro-abortion. That's not the right term. And he never did it again. But but for the most part, the local press was very fair. Not too many. Again, that's pretty minor in the scheme of things. Again, the national press, I told you about the one person who was very unfair, but I don't have a whole lot of other examples of being treated unfairly. I really don't. You guys know the This American Life? So I was all excited. They wanted to cover, after I won by 20 points in a district that swung 17 points to Donald Trump, there was like how in the heck did this happen? So I got a lot of national press at that time. And so This America Life, which is how do you describe it? It's like National Public Radio. I think it's a National Public Radio program where they do in-depth stories. What's the best way to describe it?
Hour-long, weekly, in-depth stories, usually on one topic for the whole hour, but like
Perfect. Yeah.
A magazine.
A magazine show on radio. I get podcast now. Whatever. So so this reporter wants to follow me around, and he follows me around for days. And I have a candidate training program where I train people how to run for office and win. It's called Build the Bench. He went to that and sat in on how we train people to run. He went to one of my Cheri on shifts. He went to our supermarket Saturday. He did all the stuff. And I thought the story was going to turn out great because I thought, we do all this cool stuff and I think we have a cool district. And he ends up pitting me against you guys remember Keith Ellison out of Minnesota? He's now the Attorney General. He kind of pits me against Keith Ellison, who was running for DNC chair at the time. And Keith is my friend. But Keith is very, very far left, and I'm more of a moderate. And I'm thinking that was an unnecessary way to look at this. But that's how his story came out. And he put in there so we were on the road nonstop, and we would eat in our car, and we'd stop at Culver's or Taco Bell and eat. And so between stops, I would say, hey, do you need to use the restroom before we go into our next thing? So he puts in the story that I'm motherly and asked him if he had to go to the bathroom. And it's kind of what is that like? I didn't think that was such a stupid thing, but he tried, I think he made me look stupid and like a hick and I hated the way that story turned out. I have not listened to This American Life since then. But, but that was I guess that was his take on this downstate Illinois Democrat. But for the most part, I was treated very fairly.
Cheri, the national press to some extent played, when you were running the campaign arm, you battling the progressives, AOC, the squad. What was your perspective on that situation?
You have one job as the chair of the political arm of House Democrats. You have one job. And we were in the majority. And my pitch to my colleagues when they elected me to run this, and I won in a competitive internal race. John Pyatt orchestrated our race, and we won on the first ballot. And I can tell you, it was a very competitive internal race. But my speech to them was, I have one job, and that is to hold on to this very, very fragile majority. And the reason I called it a fragile majority is because how we got into the majority is we won by 5 points or less in these highly, highly, highly competitive districts. So I had one job, and that was to hold on to the majority. And so the farther left wing of our party was very critical of me for how we were spending our money with the consultants. And I said we are not going to spend one dime on consultants who are supporting challengers to our incumbents. That is the right decision. I would make that again today, but they thought that was trying to block people from entering elected office. And I'm like, you can fight that fight with somebody else, but my job is to hang on to this very fragile majority, which we did. We lost some seats, but we hung on to the majority. And because we lost some seats, and because the polling showed that we were actually going to pick up seats, it was a very, very tough time to accept all of that. But yeah, it was the press which, likes, the yin and the yang, this group against that group. That's, and as a reporter, right, you like those stories. But, when you're on the receiving end of it, that was hard. I'm not saying it was unfair, because that was real. I mean, it was real that there was fighting going on. It wasn't fighting that I really cared about or wanted to engage in, but it was there. Yeah.
I'm Olga Widener from Carbondale, Illinois. And I know you mentioned funding, and I wanted to say you probably know that the House voted to defund the UN regular budget and the peacekeeping budget. Okay, my question is, where is all the humanity in reaching decisions on funding solely on monetary value when all of humanity is suffering and there's so many global challenges ahead?
Well, you have people who are serving in federal government who hate the federal government. That's a problem. You have people who, look at this. This war in Ukraine is incredibly, incredibly important that Ukraine wins that. For the future of our world, that is, it's hard, it's not a soundbite, but you have a good number of members of Congress now who don't want to continue to fund making sure that Ukraine is successful. My very last congressional trip, I was on the Ag Committee for all 10 years. And Yusuf from Carterville he handled all of our legislation on the Ag Committee, which you probably know this, but that is where a lot of the food programs come out of that Ag Committee. So my very last congressional trip was to all around food programs in overseas. I went to Africa, we went to Senegal, we went to Ghana. We ended up spending time in Rome with Cindy McCain, who oversees the food programs as an ambassador. But it was a really important trip, but it ended up being we didn't have Republicans on the trip. And part of it is if you see something up close and you understand the importance of feeding people who are hungry and in actually teaching people to grow crops in a way that they can feed themselves. That was a good part of this trip. All of that is really important, and funding those programs is really, really important. But I don't know, we are not going to convince some people of the humanitarian side of that. You hope that people like that don't win re-election, but because of severe gerrymandering, I'll say three things that if I think if three things changed, things like that would be corrected. I think if we got rid of gerrymandering, here's my new idea. What do you think of this? We have artificial intelligence. Have artificial intelligence draw fair districts all over the country. So we have swing districts all over the place. I think that would lead to a lot better elected officials. Thank you. Don't you think that's a great idea? Or have a commission that, how do you find anybody who's not partisan in one way or another? That's what I'm thinking. Artificial intelligence might be something good to come out of that. Number two, money in politics. The Citizens United ruling really has hurt democracy. We should not have corporations and really, really rich people deciding who's elected, and they are through their money. And number three, I'm very interested in this ranked choice voting. And so we get rid of the primary process where that leads to the far, far right winning and leads to the far, far left winning in more of the districts that lean heavily Democratic or heavily Republican. I just don't, and if you have ranked choice voting, it leads to more people being reasonable in the middle. So those are the three things I think would lead to better makeup of Congress and to better decisions around the humanitarian crisis that we have all over the world, actually. I think Joe Biden understands that really well.
The president wanted a complete budget funded.
Yeah. I think our Secretary of State understands it as well, but we have a problem. Glenn Bouchard.
May I share a story?
Please.
Totally non-political about your father.
Do you think they'll care?
Yeah.
You do? Okay.
He was one of the greatest humanitarians I had ever known. He helped me in so many ways. But when I was in Congress, they had the Major League All-Star game in Baltimore Stadium, New Camden Yards, which had been the architecture was developed by a young lady from Heron, Illinois, who worked for an architecture firm out of Kansas City, which built that stadium. So I was determined to go to that All-Star game. I had to. I worked for a month and a half. I could not get a ticket. It sold out months in advance, months in advance. I don't know why. I never thought about your father because at that time, he had become executive director for the commissioner of Major League Baseball. So at 1 o'clock in the afternoon of the All-Star game, I called him and I said, I really would give anything in the world. I called every congressman from Maryland. I called the U.S. senators. I can't get a ticket to this game. It's been sold out for months. He goes, the commissioner will have a staff person at gate 7 at 7 o'clock. You be there. Washington. I got to Baltimore in time. I was waiting with 2 tickets, and they were 2 of the best tickets.
Oh, awesome. That's awesome. Thank you, Glenn. So that makes him a great humanitarian. Thanks for sharing that. I love it.
Cheri, maybe as a final question, tell us about your life since Congress. I know you're working for Mercury. Tell us about the work you're doing. I know we're talking about some rural summits that you'd like to see if you can put together.
Yeah. So I work for this firm called Mercury. It's been around for 20 plus years, has 20 offices all over the country, about 130 people. They didn't have any presence in Illinois or the Midwest. And so they have charged me with opening offices here. We have an office in Chicago, which I'm so excited about with the Democratic Convention being in Chicago. We're at 225 North Michigan. So we are right, you can look out my window and see the Bean at Millennium Park. So like great location, right between McCormick Place and the United Center, which is where a lot of the activities are going on, right by the Hyatt, down the street from the Conrad Hilton. So great location. I have reserved all of our meeting space, including a terrace that can accommodate hundreds of people, to little conference rooms where you could have coffees or breakfast. I've reserved it for that whole week so we can accommodate a lot of great events, I hope. But it's a public affairs firm, so we do communications. We take on a lot of different issues. What I am most excited about is I can still be involved politically. And one of the things that I'm working on with the Democratic National Convention is to do these regional rural summits all over the country in the toughest congressional districts in the states that Joe Biden has to win to be successful, where we would go in, we would bring in a cabinet secretary that would be an appropriate fit for those districts. We would bring in the member of Congress who represents those districts, and we would just do a bunch of listening. And we would say, what does President Biden need to do for rural America, and what should he have in his platform for the next 4 years? And I am really excited. My favorite stories were always to not know what the answer was going into a story. And that the only way you would find out what the answer was by asking a lot of questions and figure out how that was all going to be put together. And that's what really makes me excited about this. What are we going to hear from people? What is going well? What is not going well? I mean, think about who lives in a smaller town outside of Carbondale, because it seems like there's a lot of Carbondale folks. Where do you live?
Alto Pass.
Alto Pass. And what's the population of Alto Pass?
400.
Okay, 400. Where do you live?
Elkville,
What's the population?
1,000.
1,000?
Compton, about 1,200, but I used to live in Galesburg.
In our congressional district, all right. You know what? I think I won Galesburg every one of my elections. I always did well in Galesburg. But that said, so, what you and your neighbors think is important and what you think is going well and not going well is probably very different than what folks in LA think, right? I mean, it's probably very different. My guess is it's probably not high crime, I'm guessing, right? But maybe you're losing population. Maybe the closest hospital closed its OB. They don't deliver babies anymore. Maybe your schools have consolidated. Maybe there's roads that are, need a little attention. Whatever it is. But I don't know all the answer. Like if I went to your town right now, I would have to ask a lot of questions. Healthcare. It's huge.
Healthcare is like everybody I talk to say the efficiencies of a universal healthcare would be, ground shaking for everybody.
And do we want to pay for that?
Of course.
It would sure be an answer for a lot of people. The story I told you about my brother, that would have been a very different outcome. I'm not saying health outcome, but financial outcome for his family.
It seems an impossibility, but that would be.
Yeah. But you got to have the political will to do that. You got to have the votes to do that. It's like anything, right? You got to have the votes to do that. But all I'm saying is like I don't know what we're going to find out when we go into these towns, but I'm really excited about it. And then so the idea is that we make like little mini documentaries out of each of these towns, and then at the convention we roll that up into this awesome story about rural America and what the next 4 years will look like from a policy perspective for rural America, and that's the platform of rural America. So that's the kind of stuff I'm excited about. Working with House Democratic women on something that we're going to roll out next January. When you see all of the Democrats standing on the Capitol steps making this announcement next January, it is something that I have been wanting to do for a long time that I can help them execute on now that I'm out of Congress. So wait till you see it. It's going to be awesome. Yes, sir.
Steve Pittman, I live here in Carbondale, but grew up in small towns early. I like the idea of your rural summits. I would suggest, or hope you think about, in addition to bringing the local congressperson, invite somebody from a district that's way, way different, like maybe New York or California or something.
I don't want to do that.
Oh.
No, I'll tell you why I don't. Because you know what? People listen to them all the time.
Oh, yeah.
That's a whole different thing. That can be like an exchange program or whatever. But yeah. But no, one of the coolest things I did when I was in office. I used to drive. Do I have time to share one quick last story? I would drive from Rock Island County to Mercer County, which is one county south of Rock Island County, and that was part of our congressional district. And we would go there a lot. And we would always pass through this town called Hamlet, Illinois. And they had this coolest sign. It was always beautifully painted. There were always flowers around it. It always looked beautiful. And when we would come back from wherever we were in Mercer County, back to Rock Island County where I lived, in the backdrop there were silos, so you knew there was some farmland over there, and there was a white church with a steeple, and it was Hamlet, Illinois, population 48. And I would always go, I wonder who lives in Hamlet, and I wonder what they do for a living. And I wondered for years, and I would always tell my district director, I want to go to Hamlet, Illinois. Can you find something for us to do here? And it never, there was no industry in Hamlet, Illinois. And I said, I want to knock on every door in Hamlet, because think about how many doors there are if the population is 48. So we decided to do it on the political end of things, because I don't know why we couldn't figure out what we were going to do on the governmental side of things. So we picked a Saturday and just knocked on everybody's door and found out who lived in Hamlet, Illinois, and what made the town tick. And it was all farmers, by the way. It was so I'm walking down the one street. So there's the highway that I would always pass, and then there was one street that went through, so kind of like a cross. And so I'm walking down this street, and there's this lady riding on a John Deere tractor, and she recognizes me. And she said, Cheri Bustos. And so I'm like, hi. And she said, what are you doing in Hamlet, Illinois? I said, I'm knocking on everybody's door because I want to know what's in Hamlet, Illinois. And she said, well, I live on the last house as you're heading out of town. Will you stop by? I said, yes, I absolutely will stop by. And so she was our last stop. We go there, and it was right after John McCain had died. And they were hog farmers, and she brought her husband into the kitchen and her son, who farmed with them, and they got out a bottle of Guinness, and they poured Guinness into all of our glasses, and she wanted to toast John McCain because she thought he was a great American. And we talked that was my last stop in Hamlin, Illinois. We talked for about a half an hour. And I didn't ask anybody. I have no idea. I didn't look up anybody's voting record. I have no idea if they were Republicans, Democrats, or anything else. But it was a wonderful day. And, then I knew what was in Hamlet, Illinois. And my guess is it was like every time I would stop by, I stopped by all of the weekly newspapers in our congressional district. And I would do that every year. And I would do it in person. And they would always say, we never have had a member of Congress stop by our newsroom. And especially we don't have a member of Congress stop by every year. And I'm like, well, what you do is important. And I would also buy ads in those newspapers when I was running for office because I knew that a lot of people running for office didn't. And believe me, my political consultants are saying that is a waste of money. I'm like, no, it is not. It is not a waste of money. It's supporting something that's really, really important. So hopefully in this short time that we've had a chance to have this conversation, I guess if there's a takeaway is I still believe that public service, elected office is still a very honorable profession. I think the vast majority of people in elected office are really, really good, honorable people, the vast majority. The staff that works in all of our offices, they are the unsung heroes. They are incredibly, incredibly hard jobs, but they know all the stuff that's going on. They make sure that elected officials are prepared for whatever it is they're going into. I think also, my guess is people in this audience are voters, but please, please encourage the younger generation to vote, to run for office. I think that Mitt Romney's announcement last week was spot on. The younger generation who's going to be living on this planet well after we are should be the ones writing our policy now. And when I announced that I wasn't running for re-election, I said it's time to make room for the next generation, and I really do believe that. I think that's really important. And so I consider it the greatest honor of my life to have served in Congress. I've met some wonderful, wonderful people, and I look at it this way: had I not served in Congress, I don't think I would have been invited to spend this time with you tonight. So thank you for coming out. I'm grateful to each and every one of you for spending the time with us. And John, I'm grateful to you and the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute for inviting me here tonight.
I just want to thank Cheri for making the effort to get here. She was amazing with students today, asking them more questions than just to see a journalist in her. And I know now that the Contour Air is up and running, we'll be able to get her back. She was here a decade ago, but we'll have you back well before then. So Cheri, thank you.
All right, thank you, John. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.